What kind of economic systems are best at allowing us to exercise the fact that we are created in the image and likeness of God?
Now keep in mind that if you take tiny steps towards any goal, it's just a matter of when you're going to reach it.
Scarcity is the first lesson of economics. Now, the first lesson of politics is to forget the first lesson of economics.
If you don't provide real, actual value to people in exchange for the money that you're asking for in return, you will lose over time.
We can see the economy as a social web that God has created for people to serve each other with their work.
We have the Word of God that provides for us a foundation for knowledge, for truth, for beauty, for goodness, for dignity and value in human beings. We have the Word of God that provides for us things like this. Ready? Thou shalt not steal.
Ethics on the legitimacy of wealth and entrepreneurship individually. Secondly, post-millennial eschatology. That is, the kingdom of God expands across the earth before Jesus comes back in final judgment. And the link to get those two together is the idea of the pursuit of self-interest leading to widespread economic growth and social transformation.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. I'm the host, Dustin Johnson, and today I have back Nathan Johnson, who I think in the past episode or so, I might have mentioned that you were the co-host of this show, which, yeah, I think it has a ring to it. So, how are you doing, Nathan?
I'm doing good. It's good to be back on Christ in Capital.
Awesome. We're going to be talking about something kind of heavy today. Well, I say heavy. It's a current event that has really deep implications and I guess applications. I don't know. I guess the listener can be the judge of that. But we're going to be talking about ACB's hearing. Amy Coney Barrett. Is it Coney Barrett or Comey? I think it's Coney.
Coney with an N, yeah.
Yeah, Coney Barrett. Her hearings were this past week or the week before that, and it was pretty. It was more civilized than Kavanaugh's hearings, or if you wanted to call that a hearing. But there was a lot of things that I think were exposed in these hearings that make me a little nervous. And so, let's talk about it. Did you get to watch them or listen to them or anything?
I didn't get to watch the hearings live, but the news was covering them pretty thoroughly throughout the whole week, so I got a good sense of a lot of the things that they were talking about.
Okay, yeah. What kind of things stuck out to you, or what do you think there are any like key takeaways that we should be paying attention to, or like just things that struck you as, I don't know, scary? Because I know that did for me.
Yeah, I'm curious what kind of points were scary for you. I think for me, the couple things that I took away from this is, one, how political the whole Supreme Court has become.
Yep.
And to the point where these hearings now are almost sound like election debates. Kind of like, What would your policy be on this? How would you vote on this?
Yep.
And that's not what a Supreme Court hearing is supposed to be like. It's supposed to basically evaluate their skills as a lawyer. Do you know how to interpret the law? Are you consistent? Are you qualified as a lawyer, as a judge? Not what do you think about this current law, and how would you vote? And if all things being equal, would this be legal or illegal? That's not what they're about. And so that was the thing that I got the most concerned about.
Yep.
When I was reading a bunch of articles, it was all focused on, Amy Coney Barrett wants to, get rid of the Affordable Care Act, and if that happens, then all of these millions of people with pre-existing conditions won't have insurance. She's a terrible person.
Yeah.
And you're like, no, you don't know any of that. And even if you did know that there would be a case that would come before the Supreme Court about the Affordable Care Act, which you don't, even if you did, you don't know how she'd vote. And even if you did know how she'd vote, you don't know the the stated reasons for her opinion, which are important when it comes to precedent.
Yep.
And even if all that you knew, it's not her problem if the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, or if it needs to be reframed in a way that will fit according to our laws. That it's the Affordable Care Act's problem.
Yep.
And Congress can do what Congress is supposed to do, and give us a new legislation that's actually going to be consistent with the laws of the land.
Yep.
So that was what most concerned me, was how politicized the hearing was, and it showed all this discussion about packing the Supreme Court, if Biden gets elected, adding more justices so we can get our agenda through the courts, is so backwards. The courts are not about getting agendas through. The courts are about, as John Roberts said, calling balls and strikes. They're about using the established rules and making rulings on what's constitutional or not.
Yep.
So,
and that's what really bugged me. It was pretty much that same thing, but it was how it exposed how a large majority of people in our society view what the Supreme Court is, or what the judicial branch is. The judicial branch doesn't make laws. They don't make laws at all. But we treat the things that their opinions as laws, right? And so it's almost like we are challenging the validity or the the reason that we have the Supreme Court or the judicial branch, and we're making it a legislative part of the legislative branch. And it's like that's not how it works. You just said it. It's for calling balls and strikes. It's not meant to for the judges to put their own personal agendas in there. This is not like a president. We don't evaluate the personal characteristics of the president and his personal opinions and all that stuff, and then put them on the court and have them kind of challenge rulings or whatever or laws. It's just they're challenging it, or I guess kind of reviewing the constitutionality of already set rules, which gets a lot of people upset when you talk about like Roe versus Wade, because for so long we've talked about it as the law of the land, and it's not a law. The same thing with the Affordable Care Act. Like, they're treating Amy Coney Barrett as a legislator, and she's not. That's not what she does. Yeah,
right.
That was one of the things that really got under my skin.
Yeah, and this really gets into the power that the Supreme Court has been able to garner as the interpreters of the law, because there was actually a really great 10-minute almost diatribe by Ben Sasse at the Kavanaugh hearings, when he basically lectured the Congress on how bad of a job they are at making laws, and that they don't really make laws. And he said, this is why we're having such vicious debates about the Supreme Court. It's because no laws get passed in Congress. So we're looking to the other two branches of government to do what the Congress is supposed to do. The legislature, they can't legislate anymore. So we're going to ask presidents to give executive orders, and we're going to ask justices to radically reinterpret the Constitution in order to push agendas through that can't get made through Congress.
Yeah. Yeah, he also had another, I guess you'd call it a diatribe, during this hearing, but it was really good. It was about, I think it was just about what textualism versus, what is it called? I'm blanking. What's the other one? The one that I subscribe to, not textualism.
Originalism.
Originalism. Why did I blank on that? Yeah, he was talking about textualism versus originalism, which I wanted to maybe let's go there next. Do you know? So, in your words, what is that? Or is it proper to say textualism is the opposite of originalism, and vice versa? Or how would you kind of break that down to someone?
No, actually, the textualism and originalism are fairly close to each other, depending on what you mean.
Okay. I kind of got that sense while I was listening to the hearings.
Yeah. So I think ACB would say that she's an originalist. All textualists are originalists, but not all originalists are textualists.
Okay.
So a textualist basically says, I'm going to look. Well, okay, that's not quite true what I said, because there was even some variation among textualists. But what textualists will basically do is they look at the words of the Constitution, and they derive the plain meaning from it, without reference to the intentions of the authors, without reference to the historical time period, without reference to the author's personal beliefs. Just what do the words say?
Mm-hmm.
Now, originalists will do that too, but originalists do want to know, what did words mean at the time that they were written, right?
Yep.
So, because the meaning of words change over time. So you do need to know what words mean as they were written.
Yep.
Now, some originalists are also interested in original intent, like what were the intent of the authors.
Yeah.
The problem with original intent is that it's very hard to know what was intended, and it's possible that different signers of the Constitution intended different things by the wording, right? And they didn't all agree on everything.
Yeah.
So, but then you have another kind of approach, which is the living document approach, which maybe you could kind of call it a textualist approach, but it's a weird kind of textualism, where basically we're still going to stick to the wording of the Constitution, but we can construe very different meanings from that wording, based on this idea that the Constitution is a living document, so that the meaning can change over time, even if the words stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
The meaning can change in order to apply to current day standards. So a classic example of this is the way the cruel and unusual punishment clause in the Bill of Rights is applied to the death penalty. So an originalist, well, let's look at the words, cruel and unusual punishment, and then let's ask, what were the meaning of those words at the time that it was written? What would be considered cruel and unusual punishment in the 1700s? All right, and that's fair, right? Of course you'd want to ask that question. And clearly, the death penalty was not considered cruel and unusual punishment, because it was done all the time before and after the ratification of the Constitution. Yet there were certain forms of the death penalty that were considered cruel and unusual punishment. So you couldn't draw and quarter people anymore, right? You couldn't tie them up by their limbs and then attach them to draft horses and then rip their limbs apart.
Although I feel like that's what some of the senators wanted to do to ACB. But anyways, go ahead.
That might be true. So we could say, given the meaning of those words as they were written, drawing and quartering would be cruel and unusual punishment, but hanging would not. Now, that would be an originalist approach. A living document approach would say, well, maybe that's true, but now we realize that the death penalty is cruel and unusual. So now the meaning of that would also apply to the death penalty. Therefore, we shouldn't have the death penalty.
Okay.
Right. So Amy Coney Barrett would go under the first category. So she's kind of a protege of Antonin Scalia, who is kind of the one guy who's an originalist who kind of represents them to a T. It would be Scalia.
Right, the poster boy.
Right. So, but that makes a lot of people freaked out.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the reality is that a document that was written and ratified in 1789 doesn't necessarily, it's hard sometimes to know how to apply it to a 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that with some of the recent Supreme Court rulings on like discrimination. Now, of course, the discrimination on the basis of sex, that was a later amendment, so it's not like it was written in 1789. But even though, that was written in the 70s, but even then it was still hard to know in the 70s, what do they mean by on the basis of sex? Did they mean biological sex, or did they mean kind of the gender,
Right.
person's gender identity, right? So there's still, whenever you write something, you're concretizing words, and the question is, are you also concretizing meaning, or can meaning change over time?
Yeah, that in and of itself is, I think, one of the scary things too. Is like, it happened right during her hearing. Like she made a statement about sexual preference, and then Webster's dictionary changed their meaning of sexual preference during the week of the hearing. To say that it was, it was, I don't remember what words they used, but it was like a negative connotation or something like that. I'm like, okay, well, this is back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago. The cultural battles are it's basically the war of over the dictionary. And when you bake that variable into this discussion about what the Constitution is, you get, like right now, hashtags that say abolish the Constitution, which is a big like discussion going on right now, which I'm like, oh my gosh, what in the world? I think that we have, if you look into history, constitutions normally last I think the average or the mean is like 17 years, or it's really low.
Wow.
Ours has lasted like 200, however old our country is.
We're the longest running constitutional government in history.
Yeah, and that says something. That says something about it. We haven't always lived up to our Constitution's, some of the things in our Constitution, but the framework, I think, was laid out really well. I've heard people even say that it was it was created based on a Presbyterian form of government.
Yes, actually, that's true. Yeah, historically, you can see that.
Yeah. Well,
Scottish Presbyterianism.
Give us the brief, like, what's a brief nugget about that? Why?
Oh, well, so the Scottish Presbyterian Church, the way they formulated church government, which is actually similar to current Presbyterian church government, is that you have elected officials called elders who represent the congregation in making decisions on behalf of the congregation. And then there's a checks and balance system, because the churches also form presbyteries, which can hold each church accountable. And then you have an entire general assembly of the whole nation, which holds even the presbyteries accountable. And so it's a bottom-up hierarchical system, but from the bottom up, based on elections, but it's representative. So the idea of a representative republic with checks and balances was very much in the minds of the founding fathers, because a lot of them came from, they were influenced by the Presbyterian tradition that came over from Scotland, and also the Puritans. So,
okay,
yeah, pretty cool. It's not
America was founded because of the Reformation, right?
Right. Well, it would have been very hard if it hadn't been for the Reformation to ever found America.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that a lot of people, and this is just a kind of a side note, but a lot of people were concerned about ACB's Catholicism, and but they didn't want to bring that out too much, because anti-Catholic sentiments have been part of American history from the beginning. And all the Irish Catholics that came over were very much discriminated against. There were certain states that allowed any religious choice except Catholicism. And it's because the Catholicism is a top-down hierarchy. And whereas like Presbyterianism is a bottom-up hierarchy, and the traditional values of America is very bottom-up. You elect your representatives.
Yep.
And there is no single person at the top who has ultimate authority over everybody else. So there was a lot of fear in early American history toward Catholics because it was a completely different way of approaching authority and government. Now, of course, we've seen that Catholics can do fine being in America, and it really wasn't nearly as much of a threat as people thought it would be. But the anti-Catholic sentiments that you find in early American history can also kind of point to how Protestant America was in its founding.
Yes. I think that whole discussion, if you dig back into history and the reason we do things and the reason we have our government set the way we do, it's definitely pretty, it has religious connotations, and it's not, and it may just be because, that was what was in the air at the time, but it's still, the founding of our government and the way that we do it is in some sense founded in a Christian worldview. So, and I think that makes people a little nervous. But let me jump over. I want to get back to the originalism thing real quick. I want to read you this, this tweet from Dan Rather and see what you have to say about it. He says, it was during the ACB stuff. He says, if you want to be an originalist in law, maybe you should go all the way. Cooking on a hearth, leeches for medicine, an old mule for transportation, or maybe you can recognize that the world changes. I look at this. So my initial thought for this was, okay, I understand what he's getting at, but isn't he coming from the side that wants to keep all these various legal rulings in place? I mean, like, he wants to nail them down as like set precedent that cannot change, like Roe versus Wade, or Medicare, all of these different things. He wants those to be nailed down on stone, written in stone, never to be changed. But if you're an originalist, don't come at me with that, pretty much.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think he's equivocating originalism. Originalism doesn't mean let's keep things the old way. And let's do everything the old way. But originalism is specifically an approach of interpretation. What do words mean?
Right.
And that's very different than what do we want to do. Originalists are fine with us coming up with new laws or new amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution has been amended. So you can do that.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's great. But we're not going to change the meaning of words. And there's a lot at stake there.
Yeah.
Because there are very few things in our society that don't change.
Yeah. Well, that's the point. You kind of, but I guess the point is, so I was reading a book by, you know who George Gilder is? He's an economist. He's an economist, and I think he was Reagan's chief economist or something like that. But he wrote a book called Knowledge and Power, and in this book he talks about how, like, the marketplace and our society needs to be as free as possible to change and you know, go with the different flows of you know, information and all this stuff. But it needs to be you need to have law that does not change, certain principles that do not change, because they have to be predictable and unchanging.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that's necessary. I don't think people understand what's at stake if you can reinterpret laws to match the cultural moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no limiting principle.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And when you don't have a limiting principle, then it all comes down to power.
Isn't this what progressivism is all about? And if there are any progressives listening to this, I'm not trying to bash you, but there is no, like, as soon as you challenge something and say, "Hey, let's stop here because this is a good precedent to set and a good way to do things, well, you're stopped being a progressive. I mean, you're
right.
I mean, yeah, you can't change indefinitely. Yeah. You have to. I think, is it Doug Wilson or someone says, you keep an open mind so that you can close it on the truth.
Right. Yeah, it's a quote from, I think he probably quoted that from Chesterton. That's the purpose of an open mind, is to, open mind is like an open mouth. It needs to latch on to something. Right. So an example of where this kind of goes sour is with the Dred Scott case. So some people want to say the Dred Scott case is an example of originalism gone wrong, but that's actually the opposite of what it is. So in the Dred Scott case, the ruling it's the first ruling that puts officially into legal language that slaves are property. Slaves are not considered property in the Constitution. In fact, slaves are not even mentioned in the Constitution. The only time that they're mentioned is in the 3/5 clause, which just says, every citizen gets one representative, or it counts for one member of the population in terms of representation, and then all other persons 3/5. And that was their kind of compromise, because the South wanted slaves to count as one, each slave to count as one in terms of population, so they could get more people in the House of Representatives. And the North didn't want them to count at all.
Right.
And so the compromise was, we'll count them 3/5. Now, here's the thing. In the Dred Scott case, Dred Scott claims that because he was living in a free state with his master, and then his master died, that he was a citizen of that free state, and therefore didn't have to go back across the Mason-Dixon line to his master's family, but he wasn't a slave anymore, he was free. And the ruling was that, well, he has to go back because he's property, and in the Constitution, when property crosses state lines, the property is under the laws of the state it came from, not the state it comes into.
Okay.
That is not an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, because in the Constitution, when it said property, it meant property. It didn't mean slaves.
Okay.
But what the Supreme Court at the time determined was that they could include in the meaning of property slaves, even if that's not what the original founders meant by slaves.
Right.
Or sorry, meant by property.
Yeah. Which, so when someone challenges on that and say, like, when they challenge originalism because, hey, look, there were slaves, well, so no, you didn't go back far enough.
Yeah, right, because slavery wasn't in the Constitution.
Right.
And the application of the property clause and the commerce clause to an issue of slavery, that was something just done by the Supreme Court in the 1850s. So what you get here, actually, if you read the dissent, reading the dissent is really interesting because it just destroys the argument for applying property to slaves, because they're counted as persons. The only time they're referenced in the Constitution is as persons, never referenced at all as property. So the upshot of this is that people think originalism is holding the country back from equality and from true justice and from, treating everyone as equal and having all their rights and things.
Yeah.
No. In fact, it's the opposite. When words can mean whatever you can construe them to mean, the only thing that's required for injustice to happen is that the people in power are not just. And the moment that the people in power are not just, then they can use the law completely to their advantage. So you need to have a law that remains fixed. You need to have meaning remain fixed. And all that originalists are trying to do is trying to say, this is what it means. And if you want it to change, then you go by the process. The process is people elect representatives, and those representatives pass laws that the people like.
Yes.
And that is what creates a more just system. Not perfectly just, obviously, but more just.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and this whole discussion about originalism versus a living document kind of take on the Constitution. There's a lot of parallels here with the whole presuppositional apologetics discussion, and I started like realizing that I was thinking about it in that way. Like I was thinking, hey, we need to have the Constitution set in stone, because if it doesn't, if we have something that changes, then morality changes and all that stuff. And you can see kind of the parallels there. But I need to keep in my mind, hey, look, this Constitution is not inspired. It's not inspired by God. It's not, it's just we shouldn't think about it in that way. But it is good in the sense that it sets that solid grounding, like you were saying, so that we can establish justice. Right? It's not left up to blow in the wind. Like morality is not left to blow in the wind, and just whoever's in power is the decider. Amy Coney Barrett had a really cool little blurb about this in her hearing. Someone was questioning her about her originalism. One senator, and he's like, "Do you consider yourself a historian?" And she was like, "No, but judges are required to study history and get an understanding of what was meant by the original ratification of the Constitution and all of these things." And he was like, "So you don't consider yourself a historian? Do you think that gives you the right or the ability to make moral judgments about people's lives based on basically what he was insinuating that she was going to be doing if she was elected?" And she was like, "Well, judges are required to study history, and they're required to look back and see what the original meaning was and all of this." And she said, "But let me just flip it. I'm not a historian, but if I take a living document approach to this, and I'm making judgments, moral judgments about people's lives, I'm not a moral philosopher either." And she was like,
right,
and I was like, "Dang, that was so good. That was so good."
That's good.
But it was like, I was like, that encapsulated the discussion really well. Look, judges are not meant to be priests. They're not people that decide what God means, what God is telling us to do, or what morality should be.
Right.
They're just telling us, what does the law say? What does the Constitution say? But I think the senators on the largely on the left side think that she's a priestess. She's the one that's deciding what's moral. She's the one that's tearing down what they think is moral. All of that. So
yeah. I think that's excellent. Yes, the distinction between what's moral and what's legal.
Yeah.
Judges are not there to discuss morality. They're to discuss legality.
Yep.
It's up to the legislature to make the laws as moral as they can be. But if you got a problem with the morality of a law, then you go to your representative or you go to your senator. You don't go to the judge.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this kind of leads to the other big kind of discussion point, which is the fact that we're going to have 6 conservative appointed justices and 3 liberal appointed justices.
Yeah. Are we talking about packing the court?
Yeah. Well, not packing the court, but though actually we should talk about that at some point.
Yeah.
But there is this assumption that there are essentially Republican justices and Democrat justices.
Right.
And that's just false.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've already seen that, this is one of the things that makes me frustrated by how upset people are getting by this new appointment. Oh, the conservatives are going to run the court. Well, we've had a lot of surprises in 2020 about how certain justices have voted.
Yep.
Gorsuch has voted in ways that people didn't anticipate. Roberts seems to continually side with the more liberal or progressive justices than he does with the conservative justices.
Kavanaugh, like after, it was funny, everyone was upset with Kavanaugh because the conservatives had gone all out in defending him after his, during his hearing, and then he made some pretty non-conservative judgments. Or I guess I don't want to say non-conservative because he's just making a judgment, but people got upset with him. So like, hey, we defended you, blah, blah, blah.
Right. But here's the interesting thing. Before Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, you could always predict, or almost always predict, the way 4 of those justices would always vote. They always voted in a bunch. It was the Gorsuches who you couldn't be sure how they would vote, and the Robertses and the Kavanaughs.
Yeah.
You would know how Breyer was going to vote. You knew how Sotomayor was going to vote. You knew how Ruth Bader Ginsburg was going to vote every time.
Yeah.
And
can you have an anti-activist litmus test on the in the Supreme Court hearings?
Well, yeah, that would be nice. But I think this is actually what also has shown me why textualism or originalism is better. It's because it's not ideological.
Yeah. It's mechanical.
It's mechanical. And the fact of the matter is, originalists will disagree at times about how to interpret laws. That's just the way it works.
Yeah.
You're going to disagree. So if you're just looking at the text, then there is a little bit of safety there that justices won't always vote in a block. But if you're picking justices based on ideology, they will always vote in a block, or almost always vote in a block.
Yeah, it's like they were set there as representatives of a party.
Right, exactly. And you don't want that. You don't want ideological justices. And I think the progressives want ideological justices as long as the justices adhere to their ideology.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But again, that'll come back and bite you.
It will. It will.
At some point, if we reject originalism, then it's all ideology. And then you get an even more divided country, an even more divided court, and it just becomes a power struggle.
Yeah, it has to. That's the story of history. That's the story of government in history. Get your guy in power, because if you don't, you're screwed, pretty much.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Man, there's quite a few clips in here that I really want to pull out and put on social media, and so I'm probably going to do that. But anyways, we will talk again, probably, I'm sure, about this kind of stuff, packing the court, which essentially makes the judicial branch just part of the legislative or the executive. But anyways, we'll talk about all this stuff. And one thing I noticed whenever you watch these hearings, Nathan, before we kind of close out, when you watch these hearings and there's this like courtroom scene set up and everything's so solemn and calm, and like you've got all of these like elders up here, and then you've got the presider over the court. There are really, really strong religious or biblical scenery or connotations there. I always think about that. Like every time you see that setting, I always go back to like the book of Job. Yeah. And you've got the thrones are set up, and you've got the I think it's Book of Daniel says thrones are set up, and so it gives me this like courtroom scene, like God's right there in the center, and you've got these people, or what does he call them? Rulers or whatever. Anyways.
Yeah.
But you got that imagery going, and it's just it always like
very majestic.
Yeah. It always gives me a little I don't know, a little time to think. Anyways. Okay, thanks everybody for joining. Go like and subscribe to the podcast. Go check out the website. We've got some merch going. Give me some ideas for t-shirts or something. My wife has her own t-shirt company that she runs out of our spare bedroom, and we can make some really cool things. Anyways, until next time, everyone, go love God, love neighbor, and build something. Talk to you later.